The deed crumpled in Yates Aldridge's calloused hand. As he stared at the cabin that should have been empty, smoke curling from its chimney into the New Mexico sky like an accusation. 3 days of hard riding from Fort Sumner had left him dust-covered and irritable. And now this woman stood on the porch with a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms, her green eyes flashing defiance in the afternoon sun of May 1882. "I said turn around and ride back wherever you came from," she called out, her voice steady despite the weapon she held. Dark auburn hair escaped from a simple braid, framing a face that would have been beautiful if not twisted with suspicion and anger. Yates dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Madam, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I bought this property fair and square from a man named Gerald Whitmore in Fort Sumner. Got the deed right here." "Gerald Whitmore is a lying cheat who had no right to sell anything," she said, taking a step forward on the weathered planks. "This cabin belongs to me. My father built it with his own 2 hands. Your father—" Yates kept his voice calm, trying to read the situation. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, and alone from what he could see. The cabin sat in a small valley with decent grazing land stretching in all directions, pine trees dotting the hillsides, and a stream cutting through the western edge. It was exactly what he needed to start his cattle operation, having saved every dollar from years of working other men's ranches. Amos Grayson. He built this place in '76, worked this land until the day he died. Her finger moved closer to the trigger. "And I am not leaving." Yates took off his hat, running a hand through his dark blonde hair. He was 28, old enough to know that pointing guns at each other solved nothing, but young enough to feel the frustration rising in his chest. "When did your father pass, if you do not mind my asking?" "February," she said, and for just a moment her voice cracked. "Fever took him, but that does not change anything." "I am sorry for your loss, truly," Yates said, meaning it, "but I paid good money for this land. $2,000, everything I had saved up. If there is a problem with the sale, we need to sort it out proper, maybe with a lawyer," she laughed, a bitter sound. "A lawyer? You think I have money for lawyers? Gerald was my father's partner in the cattle business. When Pa died, Gerald said he would help me manage things. Instead, he helped himself to everything, including selling my home out from under me." The pieces started falling into place. Yates had thought the price suspiciously low for such prime land. "Did your father have a will?" "Nothing written down. Pa trusted Gerald like a brother." She shifted the rifle slightly. "That trust got me nowhere except looking down a barrel at strangers who think they own my home. My name is Yates Aldridge, and I am not your enemy here," he said, taking a careful step forward. "Seems to me we both got cheated by the same man. But night is coming on, and my horse needs water and rest. Can we at least talk about this without the Winchester pointing my direction?" She studied him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she slowly lowered the rifle. "My name is Abigail Grayson. You can water your horse at the stream and make camp by the cottonwoods, but you are not setting foot in this cabin." It was not much, but it was a start. Yates nodded and led his bay gelding toward the water. As he walked, he could feel her eyes on his back, watching every move. The situation was a mess, no doubt about it, but something told him that Abigail Grayson was telling the truth. Gerald Whitmore had played them both for fools. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Yates finished setting up a simple camp. He had bedroll, some supplies, and not much else. Everything he owned had gone into buying this land. He started a small fire and put coffee on to boil, watching the cabin from the corner of his eye. Smoke still rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. It looked like a home, lived in and cared for, not some abandoned property ripe for purchase. He was stirring beans in a pan when he heard footsteps. Abigail approached with the rifle still in hand, though it pointed at the ground now. In her other hand she carried a covered plate. "I made too much supper," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Seemed wasteful to let it go to the dogs." Yates stood, taking the plate she offered. When he lifted the cloth, the smell of roasted venison and potatoes made his stomach clench with hunger. "That is mighty kind of you, Miss Grayson. It is just food." She turned to go, then stopped. "And it is Abigail. Miss Grayson was my mother. Then you should call me Yates." He gestured to the log he had been sitting on. "Would you stay and talk? I promise I am just a rancher trying to start fresh, not some claim jumper." She hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, she sat down on a rock across from the fire, keeping the Winchester close. "Start fresh from where?" "Texas originally, but I have worked ranches all over. Kansas, Colorado, even up in Montana for a spell." He took a bite of the venison and nearly groaned at how good it tasted. "You are one fine cook. My mother taught me before she passed when I was 12. Abigail stared into the fire. "After that, it was just Pa and me. He taught me everything else. How to ride, shoot, track game, manage cattle. Said I was better than any son he could have asked for. Sounds like he was a good man. The best." Her voice went quiet. "Which is why it kills me that Gerald took advantage of him being gone. Pa always said people were mostly good if you gave them a chance. I guess he was wrong about that." Yates set down his fork. "I rode through Fort Sumner on my way here. Where would I find Gerald Whitmore?" Her eyes snapped to his. "Why?" "Because one of us got cheated, maybe both of us. I want answers, and I want my money back if this sale was not legitimate. He runs cattle on the other side of the county, has a big spread and hired men to do his dirty work." Abigail picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. Going after him alone would be foolish. Maybe so, but sitting here arguing over who owns what will not solve anything either. Yates met her gaze. "Tell me straight, do you have any legal claim to this land?" "My father built this cabin and filed a homestead claim. I have been working this land and paying what expenses there were since he died. That should count for something." "It should," Yates agreed. "But without a will or some paper saying it passes to you, the law might see it different." Abigail stood abruptly. "The law? The law is written by men for men. What chance does a woman alone have against someone like Gerald? Not much, I reckon." Yates stood too. "But maybe you are not alone in this fight. Gerald cheated both of us. Why not work together to make it right?" She looked at him like he had suggested they fly to the moon. "Work together how exactly? You want what I have." "I want land to build a life on, that is true, but I do not want it by stealing from a woman who already lost her father." He took a step closer. "What if we go to Fort Sumner together, confront Gerald and get to the bottom of this? If it turns out he had no right to sell, I get my money back. If the sale was legal, then we figure out some other arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Yates had not thought that far ahead, but he pushed forward anyway. "I do not know yet, but there has to be something better than you pointing a rifle at me and me sleeping under the stars on land I paid for." Abigail studied him again with those sharp green eyes. "Why would you help me?" "You do not know me from Eve." "Because my mama raised me to know right from wrong, and this situation does not sit right with me." He offered his hand. "What do you say? Truce until we sort this out." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before she took it. Her grip was firm and calloused from hard work. "Truce, but I am keeping the Winchester close. Would not expect anything different." They left at dawn the next morning, both riding side by side across the New Mexico landscape. Yates watched how Abigail sat her horse, a pretty chestnut mare, with the ease of someone who had grown up in the saddle. She wore practical clothing, men's trousers and a work shirt, with her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. The Winchester rested in a scabbard on her saddle. "How long have you been on your own?" Yates asked as they followed the trail toward Fort Sumner. "Since February, like I said. Almost 4 months now." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Gerald came around right after the funeral, all sympathetic and helpful. Said he would manage the cattle until I got back on my feet, sold off half the herd and claimed it was necessary. Then he stopped coming around altogether. When I rode to his place to ask what was happening, his men turned me away at the gate. And you have been managing alone since then." "I still have a dozen head of cattle and enough supplies to get by. Plus, I hunt." She patted the rifle. "I am not helpless, despite what men like Gerald think." "I never thought you were helpless," Yates said. "Woman who can hold a stranger at gunpoint and cook a meal like that has more capability than most men I know." A slight smile touched her lips, the first he had seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges that worry and grief had carved. "You are just saying that because you want to stay in the cabin." "Maybe," he admitted with a grin, "but it is also true." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The land spread out around them in shades of gold and green, mountains rising in the distance with their peaks still touched by snow. It was beautiful country, wild and open in a way that made Yates's chest expand with possibility. "Why this land?" Abigail asked suddenly. "There is cheaper property out there. Not with water like that stream and grazing land already suitable for cattle. Plus, it is far enough from town to have peace but close enough to get supplies when needed." He glanced at her. "Your father picked a good spot." He always said this valley spoke to him. The first time he saw it, he knew it was home. Her voice carried that grief again, fresh despite the months. "We were happy here. What happened to your mother? Influenza? There was an outbreak that winter and she never recovered." Abigail adjusted her hat against the climbing sun. "Pa was lost without her for a while. She was the one who made our little cabin feel like a real home. But eventually, he found his footing again, threw himself into building up the ranch. I think he hoped to create something big enough to honor her memory. Sounds like he succeeded. That cabin is solid and the land is well maintained. For all the good it does me now." Bitterness crept back into her tone. "A woman cannot just run a ranch alone, not in the eyes of people who matter. Then it is a good thing those people are fools." She looked at him sharply, then away, but he caught the hint of a smile again. Fort Sumner bustled with activity when they arrived in the late afternoon. The town had grown up around the old military fort, and while the army had pulled out years ago, the settlement remained. Ranchers, merchants, drifters, and outlaws all mixed together in an uneasy frontier community. Yates had spent one night here when he first arrived, just long enough to meet Gerald Whitmore at the land office and exchange money for a deed. Where would Gerald be this time of day? Yates asked as they tied their horses outside the general store. Either at the saloon or the land office, depending on whether he is drinking or scheming. Abigail checked the rifle, making sure it was secure. Probably both. They tried the land office first. A clerk looked up from his desk, his expression souring when he saw Abigail. "You got business here?" He asked in a tone that suggested she better not. "We need to see the records for the Grayson homestead," Yates said before Abigail could respond, "and any sales involving that property. That would be private business." Yates pulled out his deed and slapped it on the counter. "I am the new owner according to this paper. That makes it my business." The clerk picked up the deed, adjusting his spectacles. "This here is properly filed, purchase from Gerald Whitmore, dated 3 weeks back." "And what gave Gerald Whitmore the right to sell?" Abigail demanded. The clerk shuffled through a cabinet and pulled out another document. Partnership agreement between Amos Grayson and Gerald Whitmore, dated 1878. In the event of one partner's death, all property and livestock revert to the surviving partner. Abigail went pale. That is not possible. Pa never signed anything like that. Signature is right here. The clerk pointed to a scrawled name at the bottom of the page. Yates looked at the signature, then at Abigail. Is that your father's handwriting? She grabbed the document, studying it closely. Her hands started shaking. I do not know. Maybe. He was not much for writing, and I do not have anything of his to compare. She looked up at the clerk. When was this filed? March 1st, 1882. A month after my father died, Abigail said, her voice rising. This is a forgery. Gerald must have forged Pa's signature and filed this after the fact. The clerk held up his hands. I cannot speak to that, miss. I just keep the records. If you think there is fraud, you need to talk to a lawyer or the sheriff. Where is Gerald now? Yates asked. Saw him heading into the Rusty Spur about an hour ago. They found Gerald Whitmore exactly where expected, holding court at a corner table in the saloon with two other rough-looking men. He was in his 40s, thick around the middle with a florid face and greedy eyes. Those eyes widened when he saw Abigail walk through the door. Well now, if it is not little Abby Grayson, he said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. Come to thank me for finding a buyer for your daddy's property? Abigail marched right up to his table. You forged that partnership agreement. My father never signed over his land to you. Gerald took a long drink of whiskey, completely unbothered. Your daddy signed plenty of papers over the years. Man runs a ranch. He signs papers. Not my fault you do not remember. The filing date was after he died, Yates said, moving to stand beside Abigail. Seems suspicious. And who are you? Gerald looked him up and down. Oh, right, the sucker who bought that worthless land. Hope you did not pay too much. $2,000. Gerald choked on his whiskey. 2,000. I told my man to ask for 1,500. He started laughing. Well, ain't that something? Yates felt heat rise in his chest. So you admit you were trying to cheat me too? Ain't no cheating in business, son, just winners and losers. Gerald leaned back in his chair. I won. You both lost. That is how it works. One of his men snickered and Abigail's hand moved toward her rifle. Yates caught her wrist gently. Not here, he murmured. Not like this. Listen to your boyfriend, Abby, Gerald said. No use making trouble you cannot win. We are going to the sheriff, Abigail said. We are going to prove you forged that document. Go ahead. Sheriff is a good friend of mine. We play cards every Tuesday. Gerald poured himself another drink. But you go on and try. I will still be here when you realize you got nothing. Outside, Abigail was shaking with rage. That lying, cheating snake, I should have shot him when he came to the cabin. That would have just put you in jail, Yates pointed out. We need to think smart about this. Smart? You heard him. The sheriff is in his pocket. She paced back and forth. There is no justice here, not for me. Yates caught her shoulders, stopping her movement. Then we find another way. There has to be someone who can help. She looked up at him, and he saw the desperation in her eyes, the fear beneath the anger. I have nothing, Yates. No money, no influence, no proof. What chance do I have? You have me, he said before he could think better of it. I paid $2,000 for land that should be yours. That makes us partners in this, whether Gerald likes it or not. Why would you do that? You could just take the land. The law is on your side. Because the law is not always right. He held her gaze. And because I know what it is like to lose everything and have nobody stand with you. Something shifted in her expression, the walls coming down just a fraction. What happened to you? My family had a small ranch in Texas. Drought killed most of the cattle and we lost the land to the bank. My father drank himself to death and my mother followed 6 months later from a broken heart. The old pain still stung, even after a decade. I was 18 and alone. If not for a rancher who gave me a chance when he did not have to, I would not be here today." Abigail's eyes softened. "I am sorry. It was a long time ago. Point is, somebody helped me when they had no reason to accept it was the decent thing to do. Now I am returning the favor." She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "So what do? We find a lawyer who is not afraid of Gerald Whitmore. Somewhere between here and Santa Fe, there has to be somebody honest. That could take weeks and cost money neither of us has." Yates thought for a moment. "I have some things I could sell. My saddle is good quality and my horse is worth a fair amount. I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking, I am offering." He gave her a small smile. "Besides, what good is a saddle and horse if I do not have land to use them on?" They found a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who rented them separate rooms without too many questions. Yates sold his saddle the next morning to a saddler for $50, enough to keep them fed and housed for a few weeks while they figured things out. Over the next several days, they visited every lawyer in Fort Sumner. Most took one look at the case and declined politely. One was more blunt. "You want me to go against Gerald Whitmore with nothing but a young woman's word that her dead father did not sign a paper?" The lawyer, a thin man named Hutchins, shook his head. "That is a losing case, and I do not take cases I cannot win." "What if we could prove the signature was forged?" Yates asked. "How would you do that without other samples of handwriting to compare? And even if you could, you would need an expert witness, which costs more money than you have." Hutchins stood, indicating the meeting was over. "My advice is to accept the situation and move on. The girl could find a husband, start fresh somewhere else." Abigail was fuming when they left. "Find a husband, as if that solves everything." "He is not worth the anger," Yates said, though he felt it too. The dismissive way these men treated Abigail, like she was property to be managed rather than a person with rights, made his blood boil. They were walking back to the boarding house when a voice called out, "Excuse me, are you Abigail Grayson?" They turned to find an older Mexican woman approaching, her dark eyes kind but serious. "I am," Abigail said cautiously. "I am Maria Gonzalez. I worked for your father sometimes, helping with cooking and cleaning when he needed extra hands." She glanced around nervously. "I heard what happened with Gerald Whitmore selling your home. I want to help if I can." "How?" Yates asked. "Your father kept a box of important papers in the cabin. Letters, receipts, things like that. I saw it many times when I cleaned." "Did you look through all of them after he passed?" Abigail frowned. "I looked through some, but there was so much and I was grieving. I might have missed something." "Go back through everything carefully," Maria said. "Your father was a good man, but he was not stupid. If Gerald tried to cheat him, maybe your father noticed something, wrote something down. It was a slim hope, but it was more than they had." They thanked Maria and headed back to the cabin the next day. The ride gave them time to talk, and Yates found himself enjoying Abigail's company more than he expected. She had a sharp wit and a way of seeing the world that surprised him. "Why did you never marry?" he asked as they rode. "If you do not mind my asking." "Never found anyone worth the trouble," she said with a slight smile. "Pa always said I was too particular, but I figured if I was going to tie myself to a man, he ought to be someone special, someone who saw me as a partner, not property." "That seems reasonable. What about you?" 28 and still single, you must have had opportunities." "A few," he admitted, "but ranching life does not leave much time for courting, and like you, I never found anyone who felt right." He glanced at her. "I always figured when the right woman came along I would know." Something passed between them in that moment, an awareness that made Abigail look away quickly. They did not speak much for the rest of the ride. At the cabin, Abigail pulled out a wooden box from under her father's bed. Inside were years of accumulated papers, receipts for cattle sales, letters from relatives back east, even a few sketches her mother had done. They spent hours going through everything, reading by lamplight as the sun set. Yates found himself studying Abigail in the warm glow, noticing the curve of her neck as she bent over a letter, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or styled hair. It was a beauty that came from strength and authenticity. "Here," she said suddenly, holding up a letter. "This is from Pa to Gerald, dated 6 months before Pa died." Yates took the letter and read aloud. "Gerald, I appreciate your offer to formalize our partnership, but I must decline. My land will go to Abigail when I pass, and I will not sign papers that say otherwise. I hope you can respect my wishes as a friend." They looked at each other, the implications sinking in. "He refused to sign," Abigail whispered, "which means that partnership agreement is definitely a forgery." "Do you have this letter your father mentions? The offer from Gerald?" She searched through the box and found it a formal proposal for partnership that would give Gerald control of everything if Amos died. The handwriting was clearly Gerald's, different from the signature on the forged document. "This is it," Yates said, excitement building. "This proves Gerald tried to get your father to sign and was refused. Combined with the suspicious filing date, we have a real case. But Hutchins said we would need an expert witness. Then we find one, even if we have to go to Santa Fe." Yates reached across the table and took her hand. "We are going to beat him, Abigail, I promise you that." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. "Why are you doing this? Really? At first it was about the money and the land," he said honestly. "But now it is about you. About what is right. And what do you get out of it? Maybe a partner who sees things the way I do. Maybe a friend." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "Maybe more than that if we are both being honest." Abigail's breath caught. "Yates, I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am telling you how I feel." He stood, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. "I know we just met. I know this is all kinds of complicated, but I have never met anyone like you, Abigail. You are strong and smart, and you do not back down from a fight. That means something to me. You do not really know me. Then let me get to know you. Let this be more than just fighting for land together." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Let it be the start of something real." She was quiet for a long moment, searching his face. Then, slowly, she smiled. "My father would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man was whether he did right when nobody was watching." "Is that a yes?" "It is a maybe," she said softly. "Ask me again when this is all over and Gerald is defeated. Fair enough." He did not step back, though, and neither did she. The space between them felt charged with possibility. The moment was broken by a sound outside, horses approaching fast. They both moved to the window and saw 3 riders coming up the path in the failing light. Gerald's men, judging by the way they sat their horses with casual arrogance. "What do they want?" Abigail asked, already reaching for the Winchester. "Nothing good." Yates checked his own revolver. "Stay inside. Let me handle this." "This is my home," she said firmly. "I am not hiding." They stepped onto the porch together as the riders pulled up. One of them, a scarred man with cold eyes, spoke first. "Mr. Whitmore sent us with a message. You two have been stirring up trouble in town, asking questions and bothering lawyers." "We have every right to seek legal counsel," Yates said calmly. "Maybe so, but Mr. Whitmore does not appreciate it. He says to remind you that this land belongs to him now and Miss Grayson here is trespassing." The man's hand drifted toward his gun. "He is giving you until sundown tomorrow to clear out, both of you. Or what?" Abigail asked, raising the Winchester. "Or we clear you out ourselves." The man smiled unpleasantly. "And we will not be gentle about it." "You tell Gerald he can go to hell," Abigail said. "I am not leaving." The man's smile faded. "You got spirit, girl. That is going to make breaking you all the more fun." Yates stepped forward, putting himself between Abigail and the riders. "You lay one hand on her and I will kill you myself. That is not a threat. That is a promise." Something in his voice must have convinced them because the man's hand moved away from his gun. "You have until sundown tomorrow. After that, what happens is on you." They rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving Yates and Abigail standing tense on the porch. "We need to get to Santa Fe tonight," Yates said. "Find that expert witness and get this to a judge before Gerald makes his move. It is a 3-day ride to Santa Fe, longer if we are being careful. Then we better ride fast." They packed quickly, taking only what they needed and the precious evidence from the box. As they saddled their horses, Abigail paused. "If we leave, they might burn the cabin." "If we stay, they might kill us," Yates countered. "We can rebuild a cabin, we cannot come back from dead." She nodded reluctantly and mounted her mare. They rode through the night, putting distance between themselves and the cabin. Yates kept watching their back trail for signs of pursuit, but the darkness remained empty behind them. They stopped only briefly to rest the horses and catch a few hours of sleep. Yates took first watch, sitting with his back against a rock and his revolver in his lap. He watched Abigail sleep in the firelight, her face peaceful for the first time since he met her. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. He had meant what he said to her. This had become about more than land or money. Somewhere in the past few days, he had started falling for this woman who refused to give up, who faced down armed men without flinching, who cooked him dinner even when he was technically her enemy. When she woke to take her turn at watch, she found him still sitting there. "You were supposed to sleep," she said. "Could not. Too much thinking." She sat down beside him. "About what?" "About how strange life is. A week ago I thought I had everything figured out. Buy land, start a ranch, build a life. Simple." He looked at her. "Now nothing is simple, and somehow that feels right." "Simple is overrated," she said quietly. "Pa used to say the best things in life fight back a little. Your pa was a wise man." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned low. Finally, Abigail stood and offered her hand. "Get some sleep, Yates. We have a long ride tomorrow." He took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, but he did not let go right away. "When this is over and we get your land back, I want to court you properly. Flowers and dinners and all the things a woman deserves." "I think I would like that," she said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. They reached Santa Fe 4 days later, dusty and exhausted. The city was the largest either of them had seen in months, full of adobe buildings and winding streets. They found a lawyer named Samuel Ortega, who had a reputation for taking difficult cases. Ortega listened to their story and examined the evidence carefully. He was a dignified man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "This is indeed compelling," he said after reading through everything. "The letter from your father clearly establishes he refused the partnership, and the filing date suggests fraud. However, proving forgery will still require an expert. Can you help us find one?" Yates asked. "I know someone in Albuquerque, a document examiner who has testified in territorial court before, but his services are expensive, at least $200. Yates and Abigail exchanged glances. They had maybe $40 between them. "I could sell my horse," Yates said. "And how would you get back to Fort Sumner?" Ortega asked. "No, I have a better idea. I will front the cost of the expert witness. If we win the case, you pay me back from the settlement. Gerald Whitmore will owe you damages for the illegal sale." "And if we lose?" Abigail asked. Then I absorb the loss, but I do not think we will lose. Ortega smiled. I have wanted to take Gerald Whitmore down a peg for years. The man is a cancer on this territory, cheating widows and stealing from the dead. It would be my pleasure to see him in court. It took 3 weeks to assemble the case, gather depositions, and get a court date. During that time, Yates and Abigail stayed in Santa Fe, sharing meals and long walks through the city. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Yates learned that Abigail loved thunderstorms and hated tea, that she could sketch beautifully like her mother but never did because it made her too sad. She learned that he could play the harmonica but was terrible at cards, that he wanted a dozen children someday and a house full of noise and laughter. One evening, as they walked along the Santa Fe River, Yates finally worked up the courage to kiss her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when she kissed him back with equal enthusiasm, it deepened into something that made his head spin. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Abigail laughed. I thought you were going to wait until this was all over. Could not wait any longer, he admitted. I am in love with you, Abigail Grayson, have been probably since you pointed that Winchester at me. That is a strange thing to fall in love over. Is it? He cupped her face in his hands. You were defending what was yours, standing up against the world alone. How could I not love that? She stood on her toes and kissed him again. I love you too, which is terrifying because I have never let myself need anyone before. You do not need me, he said. You are the strongest person I know, but maybe we could choose to be together anyway, partners in everything. Partners, she repeated, smiling. I like the sound of that. The court date finally arrived. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe was an imposing building, and Gerald Whitmore looked confident as he sat with his own lawyer, a slick man named Morrison, who had a reputation for winning through intimidation. The judge, a severe woman named Justice Catherine Winters, listened to both sides present their cases. The document examiner testified that the signature on the partnership agreement showed signs of forgery, hesitation marks, and inconsistencies, with known samples of Amos Grayson's handwriting from other documents. Ortega presented the letter proving Amos had refused to enter into partnership, and the suspicious timing of the agreement's filing. Morrison argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the letter only proved Amos had initially refused, not that he had not changed his mind later. He painted Abigail as a bitter daughter trying to overturn a legitimate business arrangement. During a break in the proceedings, Gerald cornered Abigail outside the courthouse. You could still walk away from this, he said in a low voice. I will give you $500 to drop the case. That is more than you would see otherwise. I do not want your money, Abigail said coldly. I want justice for my father. Your father was a fool who died broke. I am offering you a way out before you end up the same. Gerald stepped closer. Take the money, girl. Because if you lose in there, you will have nothing and nowhere to go. Yates appeared at Abigail's shoulder. She already told you no, now step back before I make you. Gerald sneered at him. The boyfriend, how sweet. What are you going to do when she is homeless and desperate? Still want to play hero then? I will want her no matter what happens in that courtroom, Yates said, because unlike you, I know the difference between what matters and what does not. They went back inside and Justice Winters delivered her verdict. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, this court finds that the partnership agreement dated March 1st, 1882, was indeed fraudulent. The signature of Amos Grayson was forged by Gerald Whitmore, and the document was filed illegally to appropriate property that rightfully belonged to the deceased's heir. She fixed Gerald with a stern look. Mr. Whitmore, You are ordered to return all property, livestock, and assets taken from the Grayson estate. Furthermore, you will pay damages in the amount of $3,000 to Miss Abigail Grayson for your fraud and theft." The courtroom erupted. Gerald's face turned purple with rage, and his lawyer immediately began shouting objections. But Justice Winters banged her gavel. "This verdict is final. Bailiff, ensure Mr. Whitmore understands he has 30 days to comply or face criminal charges." She looked at Abigail. "Miss Grayson, your father's legacy is restored. Use it well." Outside the courthouse, Abigail broke down crying in Yates's arms, all the fear and stress of the past months finally releasing. He held her close, murmuring reassurances, his own eyes wet with relief and joy. "It is over," she kept saying. "It is really over. It is over," he agreed. "And we won." Ortega joined them with a satisfied smile. "Justice Winters is known for her fairness, but I was still worried. Gerald Whitmore has slithered out of consequences before." "Not this time," Abigail said, wiping her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Ortega, for everything. Thank you for giving me the chance to put that man in his place." Ortega shook both their hands. "Now, about my fee. The expert witness cost $200. I will take my usual 20% of the damages, which comes to $600. That leaves you $2,200, more than enough to rebuild and restock your ranch." It was more money than Abigail had ever seen. Combined with getting her cattle back and the land secured in her name, she was financially stable for the first time since her father died. But there was still the matter of Yates's original purchase. "I still have the deed for the land I bought from Gerald," Yates said as they sat in Ortega's office handling the paperwork. "Since that sale was based on fraud, I assume it is void, correct?" Ortega said. "You would be entitled to recover your $2,000 from Gerald as well, though getting money from that man might prove difficult." Yates looked at Abigail. "Or we could find another arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" she asked, though her eyes sparkled with understanding. "Well, you have a ranch that is probably too much for one person to manage long-term, and I have ranching experience and $2,000 that needs to go somewhere." He took her hand across the desk. "We could be partners, real partners, in business and in life if you will have me." "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" "I am asking if you will marry me, Abigail Grayson. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything." He pulled out a simple gold band he had bought in Santa Fe during the trial preparation. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, raise cattle and children, and grow old watching sunsets over your father's valley. Say yes." She was crying again, but smiling through it. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her while Ortega discreetly stepped out to give them privacy. They were married a week later in a small ceremony in Santa Fe, with Ortega and his wife as witnesses. Abigail wore a simple blue dress, and Yates wore his cleanest shirt and borrowed jacket. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the way they looked at each other while speaking their vows, the promises they made to stand together through whatever came. The journey back to Fort Sumner felt different than any of their previous trips. They were husband and wife now, partners in the truest sense. They stopped along the way to camp under the stars, and Yates made love to his wife with a tenderness that brought tears to both their eyes. "I never thought I could be this happy," Abigail whispered as they lay tangled together afterward. "After Pa died, I thought my life was over." "It was just beginning," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "This is just the start of our story." When they finally reached the cabin, they found it still standing but ransacked. Gerald's men had clearly been through looking for anything valuable, but the structure was intact. It would take work to set it right, but they had time and each other. Gerald proved difficult about returning the cattle and paying the damages, as expected. But with the court order in hand and the threat of criminal prosecution hanging over him, he eventually complied. The cattle were returned, looking thin but alive. The money came in installments, but it came. Yates and Abigail threw themselves into rebuilding the ranch. They repaired the cabin, expanded the barn, and carefully managed the cattle through the summer and fall. Yates's experience combined with Abigail's knowledge of the specific land made them a formidable team. By winter, they had increased the herd size and established contracts with buyers in Santa Fe, but it was not just about the work. It was about the life they built together in the spaces between. It was Abigail teaching Yates her mother's recipes and him playing harmonica while she sketched by firelight. It was long conversations on the porch and heated debates about whether to buy more cattle or invest in better fencing. It was the way they fit together, two strong-willed people who brought out the best in each other. The first real test came that winter when a blizzard struck, trapping them in the cabin for 3 days. They burned through their firewood faster than expected, and the temperature inside dropped dangerously low. But instead of panicking, they worked together, Yates breaking up furniture to keep the fire going while Abigail rationed their food. When the storm finally broke, they emerged exhausted but united, confident they could weather anything together. Spring brought new challenges and new blessings. The cattle calved successfully, adding to their herd, and Abigail discovered she was pregnant. "Are you happy?" she asked Yates when she told him, suddenly uncertain. They had not planned for a child so soon. His face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen. "Happy, Abigail, I am overjoyed, terrified but overjoyed." "Me too," she admitted, laughing and crying at once. "I have no idea how to be a mother. And I have no idea how to be a father. We will figure it out together." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach. Just like everything else, the pregnancy was not easy. Abigail suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and the summer heat made her miserable. But Yates was there for all of it, holding her hair while she was sick, fanning her on hot days, rubbing her swollen feet at night. He took over the harder ranch work without complaint, determined to keep her and the baby safe. In December of 1883, with snow falling softly outside and a midwife from Fort Sumner in attendance, Abigail gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Amos, after her father. Yates held his son for the first time with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect. Just like his father," Abigail said from the bed, exhausted but glowing, watching Yates with baby Amos. Abigail fell in love with him all over again. He was a natural father, patient and gentle despite his rough rancher's hands. He sang to Amos, walked him when he cried, and stared at him for hours like he could not believe such a miracle existed. The years that followed brought more children, a daughter they named Clara in 1885, then twin boys, Samuel and Daniel, in 1887. The cabin had to be expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The ranch prospered too, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. Gerald Whitmore left the territory shortly after paying his court-ordered damages, unable to face the social ostracism that followed his exposure as a fraud and thief. No one was sorry to see him go. Yates and Abigail became pillars of the Fort Sumner community. They were known for their fair dealings and their willingness to help neighbors in trouble. Abigail started a school for ranch children, teaching them reading and arithmetic in the cabin during winter months. Yates served on the county council, advocating for better roads and fair treatment of small ranchers. But their greatest joy remained each other and the family they had built. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked one such evening, her head on Yates's shoulder. "Buying this land sight unseen. Getting tangled up with a stubborn woman and her problems." "Not for a single second," Yates said, kissing her temple. "That stubborn woman is the best thing that ever happened to me. Even when I pointed a rifle at you, especially then," he laughed, "I knew right away you were someone special. Someone worth fighting for." "We did a lot of fighting," she reflected, "for the land, for justice, for our life together. And we won every battle that mattered." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring. "We built something real here, Abigail. Something that will last long after we are gone." She looked out at the land her father had claimed, the cabin he had built, now expanded and full of life and laughter. She thought about the terrified, angry woman she had been when Yates first rode up, certain she would lose everything. She had lost nothing. Instead, she had gained everything: a partner, a love, a family, a future. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me. For standing with me. For loving me even when I was difficult and scared." "You do not have to thank me for loving you," Yates said. "That is the easiest thing I have ever done." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast New Mexico sky. From inside the cabin came the sound of one of the children laughing, and Abigail smiled. This was everything she had never dared to dream. This was home. As the years continued to pass, their love only deepened. They faced droughts and harsh winters, watched their children grow into strong, capable young people who would carry on the ranch's legacy. Amos grew into a serious boy who loved the cattle as much as his grandfather had. Clara had her mother's fierce independence and her father's steady heart. The twins were inseparable troublemakers who kept everyone on their toes. In 1892, when Yates turned 38 and Abigail 32, they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party that drew neighbors from all over the county. Standing in their expanded cabin, surrounded by friends and family, they renewed their vows with the same passion and certainty they had felt that day in Santa Fe. "I would choose you again," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day, in every life, I would choose you." "And I would choose you," Abigail replied. "My partner, my love, my home." Their children groaned good-naturedly at the display of affection, but Amos, now 9 years old, leaned over to Clara and whispered, "I want to find love like that someday." Clara, 7 and wise beyond her years, nodded. "Me too. Mama and Papa make it look easy, but I bet it was hard sometimes." "Anything worth having is hard," Samuel said, parroting something he had heard his parents say 1,000 times. "But they make it work because they are partners," Daniel added. The twins were right. Partnership was the secret, the foundation of everything Yates and Abigail had built. They had started as adversaries, become allies, grown into lovers, and matured into the kind of partners who could finish each other's sentences and work together seamlessly. When Amos was 15, Yates began teaching him the business side of ranching, just as he taught all the children to ride and work cattle. But it was Abigail who taught them the deeper lessons about standing up for what was right, about fighting for justice, about never giving up even when the world seemed against you. "Your mother is the bravest person I know," Yates told his children one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "When I met her, she was facing impossible odds, but she never surrendered. She taught me what true courage looks like." Abigail blushed. "I was just stubborn." "You were brave," Yates insisted, "and you still are, every day." As their children reached adulthood and began making their own ways in the world, Yates and Abigail found themselves with more time for each other. They took long rides across their property, reliving memories and making new ones. They traveled to Santa Fe occasionally, always stopping to visit Samuel Ortega, who had become a dear friend over the years. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Yates and Abigail stood on their porch watching the sunrise. They were older now, with silver threading through their hair and lines etched on their faces by years of laughter and hard work. But when Yates took Abigail's hand, the spark between them was as alive as ever. "We have had a good life," Abigail said. "The best life," Yates agreed. "And it is not over yet. We have grandchildren to spoil and a ranch to run." Amos had married a sweet girl from Fort Sumner and given them 2 grandchildren already, with another on the way. Clara was engaged to a lawyer from Santa Fe, determined to follow in Samuel Ortega's footsteps and fight for justice. The twins had started their own ranch on land adjacent to the family property, building on everything their parents had taught them. The Aldridge Ranch was now one of the largest and most respected in New Mexico territory, a legacy that would continue for generations. But more than that, it was a testament to the power of love, partnership, and refusing to give up on what mattered. Years later, when Yates and Abigail were in their 60s, they would sit in rocking chairs on that same porch and watch their grandchildren play in the yard. The cabin had been rebuilt entirely by then, transformed into a proper ranch house, but they had kept one room exactly as it had been the room where Abigail had first stood her ground against a stranger who would become her everything. "You remember the first thing I said to you?" Abigail asked one lazy summer afternoon. "Turn around and ride back wherever you came from," Yates quoted with a grin. "You were terrifying." "I was terrified," she corrected. "I thought I was going to lose everything. Instead, you gained everything. We both did." She reached over and took his weathered hand in hers. "I love you, Yates Aldridge, more now than the day I married you. And I love you, Abigail Aldridge, more every single day." Their oldest grandson, young Amos Jr., approached the porch with a question about the cattle. As Yates patiently explained something about rotation grazing, Abigail watched them with a full heart. This was the life she and Yates had built from nothing but determination and love. This was the legacy of a rancher who had bought a cabin site unseen and the woman who had refused to leave. As the sun set over the New Mexico mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Yates and Abigail sat together in contented silence. They had faced every challenge life threw at them and emerged stronger. They had built not just a ranch, but a family, a home, a love that would echo through generations. And it had all started with a crumpled deed, a rifle and 2 stubborn people who refused to back down from the fight, from injustice, and eventually, from the undeniable pull of their hearts toward each other. What began as a conflict over property had transformed into the greatest love story either of them could have imagined. In the end, Yates had been right that very first day. They had both been cheated by Gerald Whitmore. But that betrayal had led them to each other, and neither would trade the life they built together for anything in the world. The cabin, the land, the legacy, all of it paled in comparison to the love they shared. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Yates helped Abigail to her feet. They walked inside together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, moving in perfect harmony after a lifetime of partnership. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with warmth and light, filled with family and love. This was their happily ever after, not perfect, but real, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. From that first confrontation to this peaceful evening in their golden years, every moment had been worth it. Every struggle, every triumph, Every ordinary day had woven together into a life rich with meaning and joy. And as they settled into bed that night, Yates holding Abigail close as he had for over 40 years, both of them knew with absolute certainty that buying that cabin sight unseen had been the best decision either of them had ever made. Not because of the land or the ranch or the wealth they had accumulated, but because it had brought them together, two souls who had found their perfect match in the most unexpected way. The woman who had refused to leave had found a man who would never ask her to. And the rancher who had come seeking land had found something infinitely more valuable: a home, a partner, and a love that would last beyond their lifetimes, carried forward in the children and grandchildren who bore their names and their values. This was their story, their legacy, their truth. And it was complete.